All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about steps to address user capacities on wild and scenic rivers. This is the sixth and final in our webinar in our 2021 Wild and Scenic webinar series. So I'm glad you guys all joined us today. My name is Angie Furman, and I am the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, River Management Society advances the profession of river management by providing a unique variety of forums for sharing information about the appropriate use and management of river resources. Our members include federal, state, local, and tribal river managers and rangers, outfitters and guides, planners and landscape architects, fluvial geomorphologists, environmental lawyers and policymakers, students, professors, researchers, authors, and a whole bunch more. RMS membership gives you instant access to the nation's largest network of experienced river professionals through our membership directory and our moderated listserv. And you can also receive free publications like our biweekly news digest email, quarterly RMS journal, and you can also get some discounts on training opportunities and workshops. So before we get started today, I'd like to let you all know that this is being recorded and it will be available in a few days on the RMS video channel. You can get there by going to the RMS River Training Center page. And then once on that page, click the banner at the top to access the video channel. Once it's posted, you're also going to find links to the PDF copies of today's slides, as well as the handouts, and those you'll find in the video description. Also, today's material tracks with the information found in Module 8 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers course of study. If you're unfamiliar, it's a free and self-directed learning resource that can be accessed on rivers.gov by going to the Resources tab and clicking on Wild and Scenic Training Modules. Rivers.gov is an extremely useful website from the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. It provides a ton of great wild and scenic river resources. A little bit about the council is their goal is to improve interagency coordination in administering the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. I highly encourage everyone to go check out all the great resources available on this site, and we'll hear a little bit more about the site later on. I also just want to take a few quick seconds to point out the handouts that we will be referring to in today's webinar, including a handout with a ton of helpful links, as well as the contact info for today's presenters. So we are excited to have 31 of you joining us today right now. If you have questions during today's presentation, please ask them in the questions box. My colleague Risa Shimoda is joining me in the background and will be helping field your questions to our presenters. And we'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Without further ado, I'd like to invite today's presenters, Steve, Liz, and Jen, to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Angie, and welcome everyone. My name is Steve Chesterton. I am Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager for the U.S. Forest Service. I am based out of the Washington, D.C. area, and I also serve as a member of the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council.
Hi everyone, Liz Lacy here with the National Park Service. I work with the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers program. I'm based pretty much in southern New England, and also work with Steve and others on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Council, and looking forward to discussing this issue with you today.
Hey folks, I'm Jennifer Reed. I'm a station level ranger at Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service up in Fairbanks, Alaska. And I work with Steve and Liz and others on the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council. But I also am a representative of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. So sometimes I serve as a bridge between those two groups that work hard to coordinate their efforts to support your work.
Well, thank you. Big thank you to all of our presenters for joining us today. We're lucky to have them. But first, we'd like to learn a little bit about you. So I'm going to launch a poll here and see who you are. So please select the following that best reflects you, whether you work for a federal, state, local agency, tribal government, or NGO. And if one of those options does not reflect you, feel free to put in the question box what does. We'll give it a couple more seconds here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here, and let's take a look at the results. So it looks like 58% of you work for a federal agency. We've got about 32% of you with an NGO, and some folks from the state agencies as well. Awesome. We've got a second poll now, just to learn a little bit more about why you're joining us for today's webinar. So we're interested in knowing whether you're currently addressing user capacity on your river, whether this might be something you're doing in the future. If you have no current needs, but you're just here to learn a little bit more, or yeah, so let us know why you're joining us for today's webinar. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. Great, so it looks like majority of you are currently addressing user capacity on your river. So hopefully today's presentation can help you better understand this process and the steps towards it. We also have some folks who are going to be doing that in the future, as well as just some people who want to learn more. So great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to take this off, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Steve to get us started.
Thanks again, Angie. And yeah, appreciate everyone responding to the poll question to give us a little bit better sense of why you're here today, what you're interested in learning about. And for purposes of the information we're going to share today on the webinar, it's primarily an introduction to the concepts of user capacities on wild and scenic rivers, and in particular, the basis and rationale for why wild and scenic river administrative agencies need to address user capacities in wild and scenic river corridors. And we're going to share a recommended framework developed by the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council for some suggested steps for addressing user capacities, as well as provide some additional resources and reference material that you can take a look at after this webinar. But then finally, and probably most importantly, based on the poll responses, you all have a lot of experiences in working through user capacity issues that you're currently going through, or have previously gone through, or will be going through in the future, and really want to devote some time to hearing more about those things at the end of the webinar session, and for you to share some of your user capacity related experiences, as well as promote some dialogue and questions there. So we'll have some time at the end for that. So why do we need to address user capacities on federally designated wild and scenic rivers? Well, in short, it's a requirement rooted in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act under Section 3D1 in particular of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and the user capacity requirement that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But there's been further interpretation of that requirement that has some foundation in some interagency guidelines that were previously developed by the Secretary of Agriculture and Secretary of Interior, as well as a string of federal court decisions further assessing what this user capacity requirement means. So starting first with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and if for folks who are not familiar with the Act, there's it's definitely recommend you go to the rivers.gov website and learn more there, as well as the online modules available on all facets of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. But in short, the Act passed in 1968 to establish a national wild and scenic river system. And three key sections of the Act you see here on your screen. The first one is Section 1B, which really identifies that there are three aspects of river values that are associated with every wild and scenic river that are to be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. And one, that's the free-flowing condition of a river, its water quality, and its outstandingly remarkable values. Those scenic or recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, or other similar values that are identified specific to each river designation that set it apart from other rivers that are not currently designated. And then Section 3D1, which I had mentioned a minute ago, was actually not part of, in its current form, part of the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, but was an amendment in 1986 to specify requirements for preparing what we call comprehensive river management plans, or CRMPs. And including in that requirement is the requirement for addressing user capacities. And then third is Section 10A of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which is really the core of the Act, that identifies a non-degradation and enhancement policy for river values, or the requirement that all river values, again, the free-flowing condition, water quality, and outstandingly remarkable values, shall be protected and enhanced. And so all three of those provisions come into play when we talk about user capacities. So then digging just a little bit deeper into this Section 3D1 that established the comprehensive river management plan requirement that we have today. This requires every congressionally designated wild and scenic river to have a comprehensive river management plan developed within 3 full fiscal years of the date of designation. And you see here, there's a list of specific requirements, and this is right out of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, for what a CRMP shall address. And that includes resource protection, development of lands and facilities, user capacities, and then other management practices necessary or desirable to achieve the purposes of the Act. And so this is all sort of part of the broader context for thinking about where the user capacity requirement sits within this planning context for river plans. So next, stepping away from the statute itself, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, we also have these guidelines that were developed by the Department of the Interior and Department of Agriculture back in 1982 to address they were termed the eligibility, classification, and management of river areas under the national system. And they covered a whole suite of issues related both to designated rivers as well as candidates for future designation. And while they were issued prior to the 1968 amendment to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that established this user capacity requirement, these guidelines provided some of the first coordinated interagency guidance on user capacities, and continue to serve as an important reference tool. In particular, they specify that management plans state the kinds and amounts of public use which a river area can sustain without impacting the values for which the Wild and Scenic River was designated. And they also provide that each component be managed to, and again, this is sort of emphasizing Section 10A of the Act, but to protect and enhance the values for which the river was designated, while also providing for public recreation and resource uses that don't adversely impact or degrade those river values. So then the third prong that we'll touch on here, informing user capacity frameworks, is the series of federal case law that federal courts have looked at, and in particular, two sets of cases. One focused on the Merced Wild and Scenic River and Yosemite National Park, as well as the second series of cases involving the Chattooga Wild and Scenic River in southeastern United States. And there are, I believe, links in the handout to these cases, but for purposes, if you'd like to delve in deeper into the case law, but for purposes of this webinar, we're just going to focus on two key aspects that both series of cases agreed on. And those two key points, if we go to the next slide, so these were key points identified by the court in the Merced decision, and then echoed by the court in the Chattooga decision. And first is that comprehensive river management plans, in order to fulfill this user capacity requirement or address user capacity requirement, these plans must deal with or discuss the maximum number of people that can be received in a Wild and Scenic River corridor. So there has to be a maximum capacity that's dealt with or discussed in some fashion. The second aspect that's important to remember here is, although a maximum number of people needs to be identified as associated with the user capacity process, there's not one mandated approach that's required for every CRMP in order to address user capacity. So the courts recognize that there's no one set approach. There's a lot of ways to meet the requirement, so there is some flexibility if you are able to sort of adequately deal with and discuss that number one key point, maximum number of people that can be received in the corridor. So a lot of you, especially those that shared that you're currently going through processes to address user capacity, or if you've developed in the past, you probably have experience with visitor use management and may be familiar with some of the materials developed by the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. And there's a couple of key terms that we're going to utilize today, as well as some distinctions as well, between visitor use management and addressing user capacity. And we're going to be focusing, so you see here, visitor use management, the process for managing characteristics of visitor use across all federal lands, while addressing user capacity is tiered to that visitor use management approach, but is specific for wild and scenic rivers. And we're going to be focusing on the user capacity requirement specific for wild and scenic rivers, but it's important to remember the general visitor use management concepts that provide a useful foundation and some consistent terminology developed by the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council, and Jen's going to talk a little bit more later in the webinar about that council and some of its additional materials on general visitor use management. So now that we've walked through some of the foundational aspects of this mandate to address user capacities, we're going to shift to some of the specific terms and definitions tailored to the user capacity requirement. And again, these are based on the statutory law, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, as well as those court opinions and the terminology developed by the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. So at its core, the definition of user capacities is pretty critical. And so the definition based on those sources that the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council developed for the STEPS paper and recommended framework is the definition you see in front of you here. User capacities is the maximum amounts and kinds of public use that a wild and scenic river collectively or by analysis area can accommodate without degrading those identified river values. And public use is an important aspect of that definition, that term public use. And that is broken down into two sort of subcategories, visitor use and then wild and scenic rivers related administrative use. And in particular, visitor use is the human presence within a wild and scenic river corridor, specifically for recreational purposes. And those can include educational or interpretation, inspirational, physical, or mental health purposes, all falling under the category of visitor use. Visitor use also includes commercial outfitter and guide use and other concessionary use that's in place to support visitor use and experiences within the wild and scenic rivers corridor. So that's sort of, as this diagram shows, that makes up sort of the typically the bulk of public use in most wild and scenic rivers. But then there is this second part of public use that is also needs to be taken into account when addressing user capacities, and that's the wild and scenic river related administrative use, which consists of use by river managers, including ranger patrols, maintenance activities, field research, staff visits to administer contracts or facilities within the wild and scenic river corridor, as well as search and rescue operations, interpretive programs, and other purposes that are really tailored towards protection and enhancement of river values. So both of those are part of the suite of public use, the term public use that we developed that needs to be addressed and taken into account as part of the user capacity process. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Liz to take us through the steps.
Thank you, Steve. All right, so we'll be covering 9 general steps as we go through this. And what I want to point out that as this process plays out in real life in your river area, the steps might need to be done in a different order. And some may be more doable in one setting, in your setting or another. But keep in mind that the first 2 steps are really very important, no matter what order you do things in. The other thing I wanted to point out is that there are different types of designated rivers. Like we have Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, which I'm really familiar with, where we have usually got no federally owned land. And so we're working with partners and various access points and everything else. So it's a kind of a different scenario for us folks who work on Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers. And in tribal areas, it might be a little bit different too. But in any case, a fundamental aspect of the management of a wild and scenic river is understanding the river values for which the river is protected, as well as the baseline conditions of those values at the time of designation. Therefore, the identification of this information is a critical step in the user capacities process, as well as the broader CRMP process. And for those of you who do stewardship plans or other kinds of plans, particularly on Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, CRMP is sort of, you can just switch that out for your stewardship plan. So the baseline conditions of the river's free flow, water quality, and ORVs can be collected from a variety of sources. Social and biophysical information documented at the time of designation can be very useful, such as in a pre-designation study, testimony from the designation process, river recreation guidebooks, interviews with clubs and outfitters, and other historic records on past uses. If historic information is limited, estimate baseline conditions based on a reasonable evaluation of present conditions. Discussing baseline conditions with local residents and others and recreationists who can provide historical as well as current anecdotal information may also be valuable in this process. For wild and scenic rivers in which use levels currently threaten river values, managers should promptly take action to prevent degradation by adopting or adjusting user capacity decisions. Substantial investment in terms of data collection, monitoring, and analysis is warranted to identify appropriate user capacities and management strategies for the protection of river values. Decisions about user capacities and other management measures should be informed by public engagement. In contrast, if use levels do not threaten wild and scenic river values and the established desired conditions for the river values, the same degree of investment in data collection, monitoring, and analysis to support decisions about user capacities is not necessary in these circumstances if it has been determined that the use levels in the river area are not near the point of threatening river values or established desired conditions. CRMPs for these rivers should recognize the possibility that user capacity decisions may need to be reviewed and revised as use levels change, like we've seen in the last couple of years. If changes in use levels threaten river values, an increased investment in planning would be needed to provide an appropriate level of data collection, monitoring, and analysis to support the user capacities decision. Identify all uses that can affect visitor experience and river values, as well as the existing management direction and decisions related to such uses. Characterize the different kinds of existing public uses and other uses. Likely trends for future uses and potential for new forms of access. Any known problems where trends indicate decline in conditions and relationship to visitor experience should be identified. Include an infrastructure inventory to help determine whether proposed facilities that could affect free flow could also impact the river's classification. Facilities that would alter a wild and scenic river's developmental character from wild to scenic classifications or from scenic to recreational classifications are not permitted. Next slide. Step 2, desired conditions. The outcome of step 2 is a description of the desired conditions for the river values and social setting of the wild and scenic river. It should reflect conditions that will protect and enhance all river values, as Steve was talking about, while allowing for uses consistent with the Act, including a segments classification. Desired conditions are the resource conditions, visitor experiences and opportunities, and facilities and services that will protect and enhance river values while allowing for uses consistent with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Public engagement is critical to this process, and particularly in the case of partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, necessary for long-term success of these efforts. Tribal consultations are not only crucial, but required by law. The identification of desired conditions in the CRMP has a broader context than just user capacities. However, integrate visitor use, other public uses, and administrative uses into desired conditions in order to form the basis for meaningful evaluations of user capacities. Distinguish between desired conditions that would protect river baseline conditions and those that would enhance them, especially if desired conditions are set at a level substantially above baseline conditions. Wild and Scenic River classification is another critical consideration when defining an area's desired conditions, particularly for water quality and free flow. A river's classification helps establish the range of permissible recreational access and infrastructure that would be consistent with protecting the river's character and influence visitors' recreational experiences. It may also be appropriate to divide the Wild and Scenic River into smaller analysis areas to address user capacities effectively. Analysis areas may be chosen based on Wild and Scenic River classification, geographic similarities, common types of user activities, similar desired conditions, user access levels, or development levels, for example, wild wilderness backcountry versus recreational/front country. Once desired conditions are identified, compare them with existing conditions. This comparison will help identify the need for action to achieve desired conditions and will inform the scope of action for other management actions. Next slide. Step 3 ties the kinds of public uses to the facilities that support those uses within a given river segment. Facilities may already be in place and designed to provide for specific kinds of public uses, or they may be proposed for future uses that would not exceed thresholds. And we'll discuss thresholds in step 5. For example, a primitive launch may be sufficient to accommodate inflatable kayaks. A concrete boat launch and large parking area may be in place or may be anticipated in the future to allow for certain levels of safe motorized boat launches to maintain water quality and stream bank integrity. If the impact of certain kinds of public uses on river values depends upon certain facilities being in place, clearly identify that relationship in the CRMP. In step 3, also further refine, if possible, the categories of uses consistent with the identified desired conditions. On some segments, for example, there may be no relationship between motorized on-river uses and the achievement of desired conditions. Other segments, however, there may be concern about the effects of petroleum-based fuel on water quality conditions. For these segments, river managers would specify in step 3 that motorized on-river use is probably consistent with desired conditions only if use levels are very low or technological improvements keep hydrocarbon discharge rates from violating water quality thresholds. The identification of an appropriate set of indicators to measure conditions in the river corridor is another important aspect of linking user capacities to desired conditions. An indicator is a specific resource or social attribute that can be measured to track changes in conditions associated with human use. Indicators warn river managers about deteriorating conditions and assess progress towards attaining desired conditions. CRMPs should include a monitoring program of both social and resource indicators that are relevant to the desired conditions and allow for repeat measurements at appropriate intervals. Examples could include camp encounter rates or a % of an area that is bare soil for high-use campsites. The outcome of step 5 is to set threshold conditions that can be used to protect river values and develop capacities for the river corridor. The term threshold is used here to mean the minimally acceptable condition of an indicator. Thresholds identify conditions that prevent degradation of a river's baseline conditions, but river managers also may move thresholds upwards as conditions improve to prevent backsliding of enhanced conditions. Reference thresholds throughout the user capacities determination process to ensure that uses are consistent with the protection of baseline conditions and non-degradation of river values. For example, an indicator might be the number of user days where groups camp within sight or sound of other campers along a wild and scenic river. The threshold might be a camp encounter rate of 25%. A trigger is the predetermined point at which changes in an indicator prompt a management response to ensure that the threshold for that condition is not crossed. The CRMP should clearly identify and describe trigger points for each indicator, the suite of potential corrective actions that it might be taken in response to the deteriorating conditions and ensuring that they do not reach thresholds, and the decision process that will be used to select and implement appropriate action. Using the previous example of a threshold of 25% camp encounter rate as an indicator for the recreational ORV of a river corridor, a trigger might be set at a camp encounter rate of 20%, which, if reached, would require a management response designed to prevent the indicator condition from declining further. So this figure depicts the relationship between conditions, thresholds, and triggers for a selected indicator. An indicator may have one or a series of progressive triggers that prompt various management actions if conditions reach those triggers. However, the need to utilize thresholds and triggers and the number of triggers to develop will likely vary on the river's management complexity and identified values. Thresholds and triggers would likely not be necessary in instances where uses in river valley do not impact each other. For instance, the existence of Zion National Park's canyons along the Virgin Wild and Scenic River and its geologic ORV may not be affected by the amount of use within the river corridor, nor will this ORV affect desired social conditions. As a result, there would be no need to develop a threshold or triggers for the geological value related to social conditions. Nonetheless, in all cases, it's important to document the rationale that informed either the selection of a particular thresholds or triggers or the determination that doing so is unnecessary in a particular instance. Step 7 relates to the specific actions prompted if triggers are reached. Progressively stronger actions may be implemented as resource conditions deteriorate towards thresholds. The geographic scale of the proposed management actions should be consistent with the identified user capacities analysis area and may vary throughout the river corridor. For example, if user capacities are being analyzed throughout the entire corridor, but one river segment has exceptionally high use, then the management actions prompted by trigger conditions could include both corridor-wide conditions and specialized conditions that apply to only that one segment. This step highlights those actions that are specifically intended to ensure that thresholds are not crossed and river values are protected. Example of management actions can vary from pursuing education and signage efforts about river stewardship and leave no trace principles to implementation of permit systems for camping and other use of the river corridor to increased river steward or ranger presence. Such options for actions to take will vary depending on the indicator conditions and the issues associated with a particular river. But it's important to recognize that the approaches taken can and should vary on the circumstances and can be applied to designated rivers that predominantly flow through federal lands to those that do not, such as Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers. In addition, CRMP may describe both management actions immediately authorized upon the effective date of the plan, as well as actions that could be taken in the future. Actions that are ripe for decision are actions most likely to be analyzed and decided upon within the CRMP process. So then, the outcome of step 8 is to actually establish user capacities for the Wild and Scenic Corridor, indicating the amount of use that could be received without crossing thresholds for indicator conditions that would degrade river values. Establish capacities by site, area, or kind of public use, provided that at a minimum, the overall corridor-wide maximum number of people is also discussed, and the relationship between these subsets of capacities and total river corridor capacities is described. There is almost always a history of past uses or strong advocates for maintaining current uses when river managers prepare CRMPs for wild and scenic rivers. While these uses may be consistent with the continued protection of river values, the CRMP should explain that the use level decisions were based on consideration of how they affect river values rather than a reluctance to change the status quo. As a result, the CRMP process should utilize credible scientific expertise to support user capacity decisions. The information needed to support upon which to base user capacities estimates may vary depending on a variety of factors and may come from a variety of sources. Sources can include existing data, published scientific studies, modeling of future scenarios, panels of experts with local knowledge, professional judgment, and social and resource surveys. For those rivers that are currently near or at user capacities, it is especially important that user capacities decisions are based on an appropriate level of public involvement and are transparent and well documented. If additional information is needed before a final user capacities decision is made, consider establishing interim capacities and associated actions to ensure that river values will be protected and enhanced until a final decision is made. Addressing user capacities, like many aspects of a CRMP, may involve more than one alternative Develop alternatives in the CRMP document that integrate various user capacities into settings that protect and enhance the river values and respond to identified issues. For example, in one alternative, a recreational segment could emphasize driving for pleasure and allow for an access road parallel to the river with scenic overlooks or pullouts, while another alternative might provide road access only to specific trailheads or campgrounds with parallel access only non-motorized. These different approaches could result in different total user capacity numbers, as well as different recreational settings and mixes of kinds of uses, with each alternative protecting and enhancing river values in different ways. Avoid creating a range of alternatives based on the concept of least to most. Rather, provide alternative courses of action that balance public use and enjoyment and protect river values in all alternatives in different ways and with different emphases. Design alternatives to provide a mix of conditions and opportunities so each of the alternatives display meaningful and different ways of meeting a variety of interests in some manner rather than a Goldilocks alternative mix that is too much, too little, and just right. Lastly, in step 9, implementation of a monitoring program will help ensure that the quantity and mixture of use does not adversely affect river values, and the management actions are adapted accordingly. Indicators should be chosen based on their relevance in determining whether user management actions are implemented as designed, effective in preventing degradation of river values, and based on valid assumptions about user behaviors, relationship of uses to river values, and changes in social perceptions about crowding. An adaptive management strategy can be a critical tool to utilize in managing user capacities on wild and scenic rivers, as new information can help to test assumptions and shape future management approaches. As a result, CRMPs should describe the process for adjusting capacities based on monitoring and other new information or changed circumstances. For example, changes in technology like drones, paddleboards, packraft, or something like COVID. Okay, so these are the recommended steps. In following the steps to address these user capacities, it's important to remember that it is an iterative process and should be tailored and applied as appropriate to the specific circumstances for a given wild and scenic river. One or more of these steps may be revisited to ensure the protection and enhancement of the wild and scenic river. Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers and other non-federally controlled rivers will probably have a different experience trying to follow these steps than some of the other rivers that are within federally managed lands. So now I will turn this over to Jen, who will talk about some of the resources that are available to look further into these steps and other things that you can do to address.
Thanks so much, Liz. That was a lot to cover. And I know that sometimes these resources can seem pretty dry. Going through the steps can seem pretty monotonous, but I want to share with you some of the specific information about these resources that are listed in your handbook for the webinar that were provided earlier by both the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council that Steve mentioned and the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council provide really significant online materials that support practitioners developing user capacities. The resources that are developed by these two councils are actually consistent with one another and can be used very compatibly. And even though they're not very sexy, well, I kind of think they are, but you know, they can seem like dry. But as a field practitioner, and I sense that the majority of the people participating here are field practitioners in the trenches, trying to develop capacities. That's the kind of work that I do on a day-to-day basis. And these resources have been a lifeline for me. If you're not already familiar with them, I really would take time to make a deep dive into becoming familiar with them. So I'm going to just quickly glance over the ones that are most directly applicable to steps to developing a user capacity. And I'm going to start by just stressing that the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council represents 6 federal land and water managing agencies, including the 4 federal wild and scenic river administering agencies, the Park Service, the BLM, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service. But the IVUMC provides guidance on visitor use in general and management policies to help develop legally defensible and effective implementation tools for visitor use management. So they're there for us. That council is there to help make sure that we can implement these responsibilities well. And the tools developed by the Visitor Use Management Council have a really broad application, beyond just addressing user capacities on wild and scenic rivers and beyond just river management in general. They are super practical. They are how-to tools that are very helpful for visitor use management that include how to approach comprehensive river management planning and steps to identifying user capacities, but also serve a wide range of river planning needs and visitation needs beyond establishing user capacities. So this workshop's handouts provide links to the Visitor Use Management Council's additional resources that are available on the council's website. I'm going to just mention briefly that there are 2 position papers to guide policy on visitor use management and on visitor capacity on federally managed lands and waters. Really quick reads, but they're great for kind of understanding the position of the federal government on visitor management and its importance, and when capacities should be established and when they're legally required. But more applicable to day-to-day planning is the visitor use framework. That was the original resource tool developed by the council, which was actually established in the wake of the Merced River decision, and was directly formed from some of the issues that emerged relating to that decision and its implications for federal visitor use management. So this council's framework has 4 main elements, and those elements are broadly applicable across any type of management application, and they include 14 steps. Now you think, oh my gosh, 14 steps. Liz just talked about 9 steps. I'm getting confused. Don't worry. They're very complementary to one another, and they make good sense. 14 steps is maybe delving in a little bit deeper and breaking down some of those 9 steps. I won't go into any more detail than that, but to say each of these steps that have been discussed or are available by looking at the framework represent things you don't want to miss, things you want to make sure you've done so that you have a defensible decision that doesn't fall apart at the end. And then one thing that I've found really useful in my own day-to-day existence is a decision support tool that was developed with the framework. And the idea behind that is that no matter what you're doing, no matter what complexity your particular project holds, if you're going to be effective, you're going to follow all of these steps, and you're not going to skip over some of them unless it's clearly been determined you don't need them. For example, in some instances in visitor management, you don't need a visitor capacity where there isn't a legal mandate for it, and there are management tools in place to address the need to allow for a maximum number of visitors and not impact the resources that you're protecting. But the decision support tool helps you advocate for the proper amount of time and resources that should be assigned to your project based on the magnitude of the decision at hand. And it's a real simple tool that helps you step through that decision process. But in my own personal field experience, I had a complex issue brewing and was having trouble getting my managers and higher leadership to assign the proper budgetary and staffing needs to meet the issue. And this decision support tool helped me get the planning resources that I needed to be effective. And so it's coupled with the visitor use framework, and it should be used to help you order the level of complexity of your work. The visitor capacity guidebook is compatible with the steps that Liz reviewed through the steps to address user capacities publication by the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council. It is not a prescriptive approach, nor are the 9 steps that have been reviewed here in this presentation. But it does identify essential components of a really solid capacity determination. So if I were in the process of developing a wild and scenic river user capacity, I would want to cross-reference the visitor capacity guidebook and make sure I'm not missing any key components as well, even though the 9 steps identified here are the essential steps for wild and scenic river capacity determination. Another resource is a monitoring guidebook. Now, Liz had just mentioned that one of the last steps in the process is to make sure that you're monitoring. There's all different kinds of monitoring, and monitoring can meet different goals. But the great thing about this monitoring guidebook by the Visitor Use Management Council is it specifically monitors whether your management actions are being effective at meeting your responsibility to preserve the resources that you've set out to preserve through your desired conditions. So it's very targeted and focused around a visitor management practitioner who wants to make sure that they are taking the proper actions to maintain the resources as it should be determined. So this council has under development a desired conditions guidebook that should be available pretty soon. You can contact the council through me or go to the council's website on the handout to ask about that if you're very specifically interested in desired conditions, but that's coming soon. So switching over to the Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council, the handout also provides links to rivers.gov. That's the council's homepage or home website. And that council represents the 4 federal wild and scenic river administering agencies with the goal of improving interagency coordination for consistent management of wild and scenic rivers. And that council's additional resources available on rivers.gov are also an incredible treasure trove. It's an encyclopedia. I'm guessing many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with rivers.gov, but if you're not, take the time to dig through it. There are example management plans there. There's a Q&A search engine there. And most specifically to what we're talking about today, there are a list of a number of very valuable publications, and specifically the publication entitled Steps to Address User Capacities, which is what this whole workshop is based around. So under development by the Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council is actually a crosswalk tool to help wild and scenic river practitioners like yourselves access a broader range of visitor use management tools, many of them, if not all of them, available from the Visitor Use Management Council that are totally applicable to comprehensive river management planning and visitor management on wild and scenic rivers. So that's coming down the pike, and Steve, Liz, and I are all involved in helping develop that crosswalk. So you can contact any one of us to get a hold of that when it's ready for distribution, which should be pretty soon. And then last but not least, I don't want to leave out the fact that each individual agency of the 4 Wild and Scenic River administering agencies may have developed other support materials, such as the U.S. Forest Service's User Capacity Worksheet. And that resource is available by contacting Steve. You've got his email contact because of this workshop provided in this webinar, and he'd be happy to share that with you. And there may be other resources that individual agencies have developed. And when we get into our discussion soon, we'd love to hear if you know of more. So that concludes what I was going to share with you. And I think I can turn it over.
Thanks, Jen. And yeah, great overview of all of those resources available. I am going to wrap up the presentation portion of the webinar by just hitting briefly on one example that's sort of hopefully illustrative of sort of the multifaceted aspect of this process. And, you know, particularly focusing on the effort to establish user capacities for the Snake River Headwaters designation and the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming's finalization of their comprehensive river management plan back in 2014. So for part of that process, as Liz had mentioned, you know, breaking up into relevant analysis areas as part of the user capacity process, they established an analysis area that included the Snake River segment from Hoback Junction to East Table Creek, and this was a section classified as recreational. We didn't really talk too much about what classifications means, but in short, this was this is a very accessible and developed section of the river, and so the outstanding remarkable values for this segment are scenery, recreation, fish, ecology and wildlife, as well as geology, and it's a really popular Class 2 stretch for boating. Many of you are probably familiar with this area. Also provides some really high quality fishing opportunities. And so the user capacities that were set for that analysis area in the CRMP was a 50 vehicle per day capacity at the boat ramp, Pritchard boat ramp, with vehicles defined as a standard full-size truck or smaller vehicle, potentially towing a drip boat or a raft trailer. And this is one of the most popular access points on this stretch of river, while also serving as an important bald eagle habitat with some cottonwoods that are critical for bald eagle forage. And so monitoring that was done by the forest at the boat ramp had indicated that the parking area is typically full with 25 vehicles. And since most river trips are half days, they set a 50 vehicle per day estimate to be their user capacities for this site. But the CRMP notes that additional monitoring is needed to ensure that as the number of vehicles and boats increase, there isn't a large increase in boat launches prior to 10 a.m. Because due to the need to maintain that bald eagle forage habitat tied to the wildlife ORV. And so, you know, the part of the reason I share this example is that it's an approach, including the indicators and thresholds associated with it that I didn't detail, but that were developed. You know, it's an approach that works on paper, but in conversations with river managers since the user capacities in the CRMP were finalized, it's clear that there's a lot more to the story and that there's challenging aspects to the user capacity approach, both for this segment as well as other segments in this designation. And you know, in particular, they've identified that additional details for monitoring protocol are needed beyond what was identified through the user capacity process, and that's critical for ensuring consistent monitoring of this area in other wild and scenic river segment. You know, that ensuring accurate data to inform an adaptive management approach. You know, that's a key aspect of this process. Obviously, one of the steps that Liz talked about. But you know, the workforce capacity for the forest is really a limiting factor for the successful implementation of the monitoring strategy across the analysis area. And this may be sounding familiar to you. You know, we oftentimes run up against the ability to implement, you know, whether it be a monitoring plan or management actions. And so, you know, in this area, this is a relatively accessible area, but there's other segments of the Wild and Scenic River designation that are in remote wilderness areas that create even more challenges for limited staff to be able to regularly monitor and collect data on. And so, you know, again, in conversations with the river managers, in the absence of being able to sort of collect some of the robust data sets at this point in time, although they are certainly working with partners and exploring opportunities to do so, you know, a lot of their adaptive management and learning about how the capacities and what they came up with through the capacity analysis, through the planning process, a lot of that is informed in part by interactions with visitor users and outfitters, in particular in areas that the staff isn't able to access on a regular basis. And that really helps to target and prioritize areas that demand additional attention based on use levels and whether it be perceived or actual impacts to river values. So, you know, in short, I share all of this to say that, you know, how user capacities are addressed within the four corners of a comprehensive river management plan is only part of it. And you know, learning from some of the experiences of river managers in implementing user capacity approaches and other aspects of comprehensive river management plans for wild and scenic rivers is really critical. And so within the handout, one of the handouts that Angie has shared, there's some links to some wild and scenic rivers management for reflection articles that were developed based on interviews with river managers, including for the Snake River headwaters designation. And so I really encourage you to take a look at those. And you know, at this point, would definitely welcome us to shift to the questions and discussion conversation. Really interested to hear if there have been any questions posed in the chat, as well as just really wanted to hear what sort of user capacity scenarios you all have faced in the past or are currently facing with to help us inform our approaches going forward, and so we can learn as a community about these somewhat aspects of managing wild and scenic rivers that, you know, can be challenging at times. So with that, maybe turn it back over to Angie to help us facilitate some of the questions and discussion. And first off, just checking in with Angie if there have been any questions at this point. Put in the chat.
Well, this isn't Angie, this is Risa. There was a question from Sarah who says, curious if any of the presenters can speak to an example of collaborative planning in which numerous stakeholders collectively determine desired conditions, indicators, etc., as would be needed on a partnership river. Are there BMPs existing for such planning? And I think you could probably talk a little bit about the stakeholder outreach and resulting, you know, effect on the process on a regular wild scenic river also, because that's so important. But Sarah's specifically asking about partnership rivers, and I know, Liz, you have lots of experience in that area.
Yeah, you know, Sarah and I work together and we grapple with this constantly and on all of our different rivers because, you know, it really, as Steve pointed out, in the real world, you can do the planning process, but as it plays out in the way things work in real life, it turns out to be very different. And so far, I think we're trying to develop BMPs for partnership rivers. And I think, you know, we've got a special study going on the Farmington and the Housatonic River, which is not wild and scenic, but is managed very similarly to a partnership wild and scenic river. So I invite folks to, especially those of you who are on partnership rivers, to contribute your stories about any experiences you have putting together a plan like this on your rivers, successes, failures. We'd love to hear it and add it to our whole list of experiences. But right now, as I said, I think we're developing it. And it's becoming more and more critical that we do this. On the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, it's a little bit different because the management plans are developed during the study process to designate the river instead of being done after designation. So it's hard, it may entail going back and revisiting the management plans that were done and the studies that were done earlier on, and like amending the plans that we have according to some of the experiences that we're gaining.
Thanks. This is from Tim Palmer. His question is, and may have been answered, but he mentions one specific river. He says, maybe this is coming, but can someone highlight a situation choice and outcomes from an interesting case study? And Steve, you mentioned the headwaters and the Snake headwaters, but he mentions the North Fork Flathead. So I wonder if there is someone who knows about successes or challenges there. And I'm not sure if someone is from that area could chime in. And well, I'll also just throw that he also said, has anyone reviewed the Wild and Scenic River plans and determined how many have established user capacities? Ooh, that's a pretty interesting question. So if someone like Coulter is in the audience, she could probably help us with North Fork Flathead process. But his last question, that sounds like a good internship job.
Yeah, definitely.
And if Coulter's not here, then Risa's speaking to Coulter Pence. And so if you know her, or you could just do an email to her specifically, Tim, if you wanted to follow up about that specific river.
Okay, great. And also Casey Andrews asks, oops, hold on, just lost your question. Casey has asked, overall, does it seem that the data collection for this process is done internal to the forest or contracted out?
So I would say there's no one size fits all approach. You know, part of it depends on the existing monitoring protocols in place that any local unit, the river administering unit might have, and their capacity to fill in any gaps that might have been identified to inform the user capacity process. And so sometimes that can be done by the local unit staff. Sometimes it involves contracting work. Sometimes it involves working with universities and other partners to collect that data. So it's really a range. But the critical part is to recognize that these are some assumptions being made during the user capacity process, and that critical follow-up with monitoring to test the assumptions about what the indicators are showing about use levels in the corridors and how they're interacting with river values is really key. And again, sort of how you implement post development of the plan and post development of a user capacity approach, is just as critical, if not more, than the development on the front end.
Thanks, Steve. Here's a good question. Casey said, thank you. Kevin Colburn says, I'm a bit confused about the relationship between baseline use levels and capacity. In some cases, baseline is used as the capacity. I guess the words are used. interchangeably. I've heard that use levels at designation are sort of grandfathered in and unlikely to be rolled back. Could you expand on the relationship between baseline and capacity? So there's two things there. Maybe it's vernacular and definition, and then one has this concept of being grandfathered and unchangeable. Okay, experts.
I could real generally approach that and then maybe get some more specific backup from Steve and Liz. But I guess, Kevin, what I would say is that your visitor capacity, or in the case of a wild and scenic river, your user capacity, should really be tied to your desired conditions, which are meant to uphold the river values for which the river was found to be included in the system. And so those desired conditions are the drivers of the capacity. And it could be that the baseline use levels are below capacity or capacity. To just assume that the baseline use level is the capacity, I think, is a more simplistic approach that federal land managers are moving away from. Thus, the visitor capacity guidebook, the steps to user capacities. We want to make sure that there is a real solid basis behind that decision making, that it reaches the number that actually serves the purpose of upholding the values, the river values. What else would you guys add?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yeah, I would just add, when we talk about baseline conditions, it is the condition of the river values. That's what we're protecting and enhancing from under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Now, the use levels associated at the designation are important to understand, but really the driving force is about the river values, not necessarily the use levels. There obviously is interaction there, but the most important aspect are those conditions for the free-flowing condition, water quality, outstanding remarkable values, how they interact with use levels, both current baseline and expected in the future. And how they also interact with the desired conditions, where you hope to go with the condition of the river values in the future.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, some more questions. Another one from Tim. Kevin says that's really helpful in the right approach. Tim has another question. Have any established user capacities been challenged by specific user groups after the plan is completed, and what was the outcome?
Well, the litigation that I mentioned at the outset related to the Merced decision and the Chattooga decision involved challenges to the user capacities. So those are the most prominent that I'm familiar with that involved litigation. There may be others out there. Certainly, I'm sure during the public comment process and to sort of get back to one of the initial questions about collaboration for within user capacity processes, all comprehensive river management plans require consultation with state and local and tribal governments, as well as interested publics. And there's more information on rivers.gov about some of the existing processes going on right now if you go to the comprehensive river management plans tab. And so through those public comment periods and other engagement to develop plans, I'm sure there are other examples of places where there have been comments about capacities that were developed during that draft stage of a plan. But again, from a litigation standpoint, those two that I mentioned earlier are the most prominent that I'm aware of.
Those are all the questions that we have at this point.
So I would just add a little closing thought here, and that is that it's important to go through this planning process and at least components of it, especially those first two steps. But, and I think that the question Tim just brought up about people challenging decisions and management actions will be lessened if people have a whole lot of public engagement and really dig deep into all the different people and users and everyone who's got a stake in what comes out of this plan. And you know, it's getting more and more challenging because of the crowds that are showing up at various rivers and the way that they communicate. And it's not easy to figure out how to communicate with people. So that's a big challenge. But I think if you just go through the actual thought process and planning process and do the best you can and really show at the outcome that you've done a fair job involving people and doing this both based on what the public and the folks who use the rivers want and some scientific basis, and just always hearkening back because they're wild and scenic rivers. These are outstandingly remarkable values. These are designated rivers, and that's why we're choosing these actions to protect those values.
Great, thank you. Oh, a couple more questions have come in. These are good ones from Kai. Is the number, in quotes, is the number adaptable, question mark? I mean, what happens if we consistently break the number because societal demands have changed? So climate change and increased summer temperatures could drive significant increases in visitation. Would we amend the CRMP to adapt the plan to accept more use?
I'm just going to jump in and say adaptive management is the way to go. And to really, given that we know what we know, Kai's projection of like, yeah, it could get a lot hotter and it could get a lot more crowded. So yes, put some amendments in there that address the potential changes that can be seen already. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, these are informed assumptions that are being made during these processes based on, you know, the data available, the conditions in the river corridor, in particular of the river values. And so they need to be tested based on collecting the data, you know, applying the indicator and thresholds and potentially, you know, the triggers for management action that you develop during the framework. But ultimately, you're constantly assessing, you know, whether those maximum numbers that you've identified during the capacity process actually are what is the relevant amount when it comes to achieving the desired conditions for river values. And it's, you know, and it's important to note, I think, when we talk about user capacities, we're not talking about enforcing limits in a lot of cases. Yes, we're required to deal with, discuss and deal with a maximum amount of public use in the wild and scenic river corridor, but that doesn't mean we're capping use. You know, it's about, you know, thinking about how public use within the corridor impacts the river values that we are mandated to protect and enhance under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and constantly learning and yeah, the adaptive management approach, which again has its challenges because it requires time and effort to go in and collect data and monitor conditions, but it's really critical to, I think, any user capacity process.
Great. This is interesting. This is from Bud. When a chemical weapons plant was decommissioned, Reagan's Interior Secretary Watt added the island to Gulf Island National Seashore, which is off limits to users because of contamination. Is the restriction a visitor use capacity or something else?
Visitor use protection, maybe?
Right. And that's sort of, you know, well, okay.
Yeah, I would add that is not a capacity because it's not going through a process to determine a maximum amount of use. to protect the resources for which the area it was established. It's just saying this is an inconsistent use. There's no public use should occur here because it would endanger the public.
Right. Okay, managing level/amounts of use, this is from Steve Lawson. Managing level/amounts of use can have limited efficacy in managing recreation-related impacts on ORVs. What else besides numeric capacity estimates are important to incorporate into CRMPs to manage recreation use to protect and enhance?
Probably looking back at analysis areas and what kind of recreational activities are appropriate in the different areas that you're looking at on your river. There might be areas that can accommodate high use or certain kinds of use, and then there might be other parts of your river that really can't. So that would be my take on it, would be to look at the different sections of river and what, again, could be manageable for the ORVs in those specific areas.
Yeah, I would add on to what Liz is saying and encourage people to look at the visitor use framework, because it identifies a whole range of alternate management actions that can be used in instances where there isn't a visitor capacity, and that would also apply to a wild and scenic river, such as distributing the amounts, the timing of the types of activities that visitors are taking, education, a whole number of management actions can be taken to, alleviate and complement the visitor capacity.
This is Reese. It's sort of limited perspective because I don't know that many rivers, but one of the coolest I think is on the Chattooga. And I don't know the letter of the basis for it, but effectively to preserve the experience among outfitted customers, the trips, there is a limit to the number of outfitters, partly for numbers, but within the organization and scheduling of the trips, and it's like not official language, but they're not allowed to have their customers see another trip. So they were scheduled. So you literally, aside from a safety thing or some weird odd weather thing, and it's not related to private users. So the outfitted trips won't see another outfitted trip all day long. And to do this, they plan their scheduling like you would not believe it, like carefully to the minute, staging, all that, including at the end. And of course, it doesn't happen that way all the time, but it's a really creative and really wonderful way to manage expectations of the users who expect to not see anybody else, because they don't, usually.
And again, that, can happen in a place where you have a whole lot of ability to work with the concessioners or the outfitters to actually show them that may be beneficial to the outcome of their business, having those good experiences and the visitor experiences. But there again, there are rivers where, there are a lot of other access areas and people can just hop on the river from wherever they want to. So those are the real life management challenges that pop into play when you're trying to do this.
Right, that example is federal, that's national forest. So that's, you have that control.
I can't help but keep thinking about the non-federal, but.
Well, I think now it seems like it's gotten quiet in the question world.
Can I just say, I want to reiterate when we are talking about best management practices, I still would love to hear about experiences people are having out there in any kind of a designated area. So if you get the chance to share what you've been working on and what challenges you're running up against or what successes you've had, maybe you didn't get an opportunity to say it here, but if you could shoot us an email and just kind of give us a sense of what you're experiencing out there. It's hard to know what everyone's experiencing, and I think we need to sort of monitor our training and our processes as well to make sure that we keep adapting what we do and what we can teach people so that they can actually get things done on the rivers the way they need to.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so I just want to take a moment again to thank our presenters from today. Again, here's their contact information. It's also available in the on the handout. And I also, again, on those handouts. And then I also wanted to highlight that next month on July 13th, we're going to be having a river management roundtable about user capacity, practices, regulation, and trade-offs. So we're going to be continuing this conversation a little bit. It's a little less informal than a webinar. It's a time where we can all come together and compare notes, learn from each other's experiences, see what might help both your long-term planning and short-term tactics. And we'll be asking a series of questions to each other, like how do we determine capacity, and what are some new cool approaches to managing crowds, things like that. So in order to register, that is free. You just have to visit the RMS events page, or I'm putting into the chat box right now a link to our River Management Roundtable series.
Hey, Angie,
yeah.
we have a last minute question from Gordon.
Oh yeah.
You have a couple, yeah. He just asked from Gordon War, can we promote one kind of use over another, in parentheses, discourage partiers? Or it sounds like one type of recreation over another. And also any successes limiting alcohol on rivers. You can tell what he's dealing with.
Well, I could just really briefly say that if you have a certain kind of visitor experience that is tied to a river value, you could definitely do that. For example, if solitude or something like that were really linked to your recreational outstandingly remarkable value, that would be kind of an easy nexus. That's not to say it would be easy to implement in real life, but the justification could be easy. Any other thoughts, Liz or Steve?
I just know from the Partnership Rivers world that working with our partners, working with the communities that we're in with the river, and making sure that we're trying to pull together a collaborative approach to addressing all these things is the most important thing, because and also having folks out on the river, whether it be river rangers or river stewards or whatnot, that can be a really effective approach. But different settings would require different things, I think. And it's hard to say to one person, your experience is not as valuable as this other person's experience. People want to be there for different reasons.
We have a couple of responses that I'm putting in the chat, just input from folks who know or think they have heard of a ban, alcohol ban on the Oregon Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. I think there's one on the Illinois, on the put into the Niobrara. That's from Tim. Some Gordon may know that. And our experience has been that estimating numeric capacities for low use, oh, this is a little different, sorry. Experience has been estimating numeric capacities for low use areas can be more challenging than in higher and very high use areas. Approach to estimating capacities for low use areas would be good fodder for the roundtable discussion in July. Oh, good idea. It's from Steve. That almost is like managing for wilderness. It gets into that sort of discussion. Okay, that's it for questions.
All right, everyone. Well, we are at the end of the webinar. Again, a huge thank you to all of our presenters, to everyone for joining today, for all of you who have joined for several of the webinars. I know that there's been several of you that have attended multiple webinars, so thanks so much. Visit the River Training Center website for updates. And yeah, we'll be coming out with something in a couple of months, so stay tuned. And thanks again. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you all.